what does a post-truth, post-trust world look like? Well, I think in order to answer that, you first have to understand how we got here, at least from a big picture perspective. I think most philosophers would argue that this began with the rise of moral relativism. There are a lot of different ways to define exactly what that means, but Nietzsche probably gave us the gold standard with his famous quote where he says that God is dead. Now, most everyone has heard that quote before, but usually they leave out the phrase immediately after it. I think it's just separated by a comma, where the actual quote is, "God is dead, and we have killed him." And Nietzsche goes on to predict that it will take many years, untold years probably, for us to fully come to terms with this death of God that he's describing, if ever. In his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he does seem to predict that eventually humanity will be capable of creating its own meaning through creativity and free will, and this being he calls the Übermensch, or the Overman, someone who's transcended the very definition of humanity beforehand. And I suppose in that definition, humanity means someone dependent upon God or the gods for meaning. Another way to say that might be that historical humanity, the humanity that Nietzsche thinks is going to be transcended, means a humanity that believes in objective reality. Now, that's a loaded phrase, so let's unpack that a little bit. Objective reality is simply the belief that there is such a thing as truth with a capital T. In other words, it's not my truth, it's not your truth, it's the truth. That is objective truth or objective reality. And moral relativism is interesting in the sense that it popped up around the time that we began to accept science as a form of objective truth, objective reality. So we let go of the idea of nature and the world being mystical or mysterious or nominal, might be the way philosophers would put it. And we replaced that with this idea that if you can make something reproducible within a lab or falsifiable on paper, you can determine whether or not it is objectively true from a science standpoint. So we kind of got half of reality into objective terms just as we let go of the other half, which is really everything having to do with the human condition. So how we perceive things, what makes life worth living, or what meaning derives from. In short, our motivations. You know, one almost thinks a little bit of the parody or the satire of the actor who has to retire to their RV to figure out what's my motivation. They still have all that same thespian toolkit that they've always had. Now they just have to figure out why and thus how to use it. So, yeah, I find it more than a little tantalizing that we became dead set on deciding that we have an understanding of external reality that's objective at the same time that we decided that our understanding of internal reality is distinctly not objective or totally subjective. As for what that means, I'm not quite sure, except that it looks to me like it's an inversion in a historical sense. Because before that, the understanding was always that humanity basically understands what's going on when it comes to our own lives. It varies a little bit from religion to religion, but comparative religion basically gets you to the point of saying, okay, you come into this existence, you're born into it, and the gods or God have a purpose for your life. And the variation is basically, do you have the ability to go against whatever that purpose is? That's kind of free will in theological terms. I'm going to go ahead and say that it seems like most religions believe on some level that you do have free will, because, this gives meaning to the hero myth. Now, the hero myth is basically a cycle of someone who is not in perfect alignment with the God's plan for their life, attaining that perfect alignment. And one can't help but notice that it's always a very difficult thing to do, and that it seems to be a bit of an elitist thing to do. The hero myths never seem to suggest that this is something that every human can do. It's more or less for people who are destined. So right there with the idea of destiny, you have this strange combination of a person, or the hero in this case, is destined to become the fullness of their own potential, and yet the very thing that's most interesting about them is the path to get there when they are not yet their full potential, but have perhaps realized what their potential is. So, yeah, that one's a bit of a sticky wicket right there, because you kind of have an intersection of free will and destiny. This sort of, you can be born under a good or bad star, which is sort of a blues way of saying astrology, the conjunction of the spheres and whatnot determining our fate, because ancient humanity believed that the stars and the planets, and particularly the zodiac, or us imagining that there are these shapes or beings in the stars, has quite a bit to do with determining one's fate. And then the myths are simply a variation on how does one get to that fate, So in a certain extent, it's almost Shakespearean before Shakespeare. It's like you have a little bit of a sense of knowing how it's going to end before it's even begun, and yet at the same time the task is monumental and no one's going to do it for you. And there seems to be this latent sense that you could just stay at home on the couch and waste away, spoil your potential. In my opinion, that is where all of this spooky stuff about reincarnation comes in. Because one thing that in fairly short order becomes apparent to a bookworm is that there are very few classical myths or ancient cultures that did not believe in reincarnation on some level. Obviously, in the West, we tend to think of that as just being a Eastern or Asian thing. It's Hinduism and then Buddhism. But really, the Greeks definitely had it. I mean, the most overt statement that we have from the Greco-Romans is probably from Plutarch, because Plutarch wrote a couple of tracts other than his famous Lives of the Greeks and Romans, wherein he made it clear that he believed in reincarnation, and he also argued that the different mystery schools that even some of the Roman Caesars would endeavor to become initiated into teach the mystery of reincarnation. So right there's a little bit of a sense that the common people, those who, for whatever reason, good or bad, are not expected or anticipated to be capable of being the hero in the hero myth. For them, you just leave the pantheon of deities. They can make their little sacrifices and have their little parties on holidays, and it seems like they're contented with that, so just leave it at that. But if you're interested in more, and if it seems like something about the conditions of your birth or the way you've distinguished yourself since your birth suggests that you're capable of more, or that you have a powerful desire for more than the common stories left to the common crowd, you could endeavor to be initiated into these mystery schools or mystery cults. And most of them would explain both the symbolism of the gods, which didn't necessarily mean that the gods aren't literal. It was just a deeper understanding of them, and the mysteries of life and death, especially along the lines of reincarnation. As best we can tell, the crux of a belief in reincarnation has to do with this strange intersection between the fact that different human lives and individuals have different destinies, and yet they don't always seem to be able to come into alignment with that destiny in a single lifetime. So, in other words, this occultic idea of the great work, well, the word great might suggest something so large, so challenging, so difficult, that the only way it could ever be attained is if it's cultivated over multiple lifetimes. That's a simplistic way, but probably good enough to summarize why reincarnation is such a hang-up for anyone who, or any culture rather, that wants to believe in an objective truth. This is the engine that makes the gods meaningful, or that allows them to provide humanity with meaning, in a sense. It's kind of like getting a look under the hood. Another way of saying that might be the average person making sacrifices or donations to the temple and having their little spiritual holidays every once in a while. Well, that's someone who knows how to drive. But the engineers are the priests and the initiates of these mystery schools, because they have seen the terrible truth. Well, it's a great and a terrible truth. That being that, if you leave the great work undone, you may have no option but to come back and either start from square one or somehow take advantage of some sort of compound interest. I think everyone by now knows that, for example, in modern times, some people are obsessed with this idea of, I believe it's called indigo children who, from a very early age, they seem to indicate that they've lived before. They seem to know information that they couldn't otherwise have, etc. I can't at all testify to the validity or not of that, but I'm just providing an example in more current day. It's a little more relatable. And of course, Buddhism, particularly Tibetan Buddhism, definitely has that, along the lines of how the Dalai Lama is selected. I don't know a terrible lot about that, so I'll probably leave that there and let Google be your best friend for that topic. But yeah, the point is, for basically every religion, especially that survives till today, except the Abrahamic ones, which would be Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, reincarnation is kind of a no-brainer. It helps it all make sense. Because I've noticed that seems to be a common critique, particularly from atheists, but I suppose from anyone just questioning whether or not there's a spiritual or metaphysical reality at all, that it doesn't exactly stand to reason why you need the gods to tell you what objective truth or reality or purpose and meaning are. When you add in reincarnation and this idea that everyone has a purpose or a destiny, and the human life, humanity is blessed in the sense that we are capable of climbing the rungs of the universe, evolving within our own lifetimes, not just physically, of course, but in a mystical sense. That imbues it all with a meaning that you're going to be hard-pressed to find without. I mean, goes without saying, Nietzsche's world of a dead God and believing that he probably never existed to begin with is one wherein you find yourself, well, very much alone in terms of deciding if there's any real purpose to your life or not. And this was Nietzsche's obsession, because he saw that with religion going out of style and seeming implausible in the face of science's funny way of demanding that we be able to prove our claims, that people would more or less be marooned, left without the purpose that had been, in a sense, spoon-fed to them historically up until that point. This he called nihilism, and he also used the word decadence quite frequently, in a way I think a little bit differently than most use it, because, for example, there's a passage, I think, in Human, All Too Human, where he simultaneously expresses some respect, or at least interest, in the Buddhist way of viewing the world, and writes them off as decadence. And the way that he says it is, Buddhism is a religion for an elderly or geriatric group of people. I think what he meant by that, especially if I've understood his ideology of what he would prefer to replace all of these antiquated religions and mysticisms, what he meant by a geriatric belief system is sort of the stereotype of being a grandmother. You know, you don't want to be too hard on people. You're very empathetic, perhaps overly patient and long-suffering with them. And while that might be beautiful, especially for children who deserve this sort of mercy, you really aren't doing adults any favors after a certain extent. You're just enabling them to remain mediocrities instead of, shoving them out of the proverbial nest and seeing if they can fly. So that's my take on why it was that Nietzsche could simultaneously praise Buddhism and write it off as the wrong answer for humanity writ large. the final thing to say on that before we get to the ramifications of getting rid of God, religion, and the mystical reincarnation systems that seem to run in the background of all that, would be perhaps to briefly explore why it is that the Abrahamic religions don't seem to have this reincarnation fascination. It seems to be because the Judaic and Christian and Islamic understanding of Yahweh or Allah definitely precludes any such grandiose idea that each human being has a potential, or even some human beings have a potential destiny that more or less has to be fulfilled on some metaphysical level, and so God's going to let them keep coming back until they complete their great work and climb the ladder of the universe. I think the reason why this is absent is because the character of Yahweh or Allah is meant to be humbling, perhaps even terrifying. After all, Christianity gives us the idea of fidelity or faithfulness as being, quote, the fear of God. That doesn't really sound like a being who's too hung up on individual human beings fulfilling their special snowflake purpose or writing it in the stars and what have you. In fact, the only example where the astrology phenomenon that we've already covered is a little bit side by side with reincarnation comes in is the alleged birth of Jesus at Bethlehem and the star of Bethlehem leading the three wise men to him. That is a bit of a tantalizing cultural crossover there, because what you have happening is this religion, Judaism / the beginnings of Christianity, that is not exactly what we would call tolerant today, stating that when it came time for the heavens to proclaim the good news, unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, the people who were first to know were three pagans who were reading the astrological signs and noticed this new star of great import appear as though it were a beacon telling them to follow it. I would submit to you that that's strange, at the very least. It's, that's a detail a little bit like one that I think Lee Strobel in Case for Christ mentions when he attempts to disprove this idea that the Gospels were an intentional fabrication or scam of some kind, because he notes that after the resurrection, but before any of the apostles or Jesus's other followers, most of whom are unnamed, realize that he's been resurrected, a certain Mary goes to the place where he has been entombed and finds the stone that the centurions put in front of it rolled away, and two angels, I think it's two, it might be one, but I think it's two, proclaiming that he's not here, for he is risen. Now, why is this an important detail? You would never have had a woman be the eyewitness to such a crucial event if you were pulling a con on people at that time. I don't remember this for certain, but I believe I've heard that women could not be used as witnesses in trials at that time. They were just considered to be too emotional, too easily manipulated, and thus unreliable to be witnesses in any kind of court case. So if that's the culture you're in and you're trying to ostensibly win over as many people as possible because you want all the cash and prizes or whatever. That is definitely not a detail that you're going to go with. You're going to have it be probably Peter, maybe James, somebody like that. Maybe, heck, maybe even Doubting Thomas be the one who finds out that the resurrection has happened first and sees that the tomb has been emptied without any signs of funny business other than a miracle. So, to conclude that little nuance, it seems like the reason why Judaism and Islam totally overruled the possibility of reincarnation was to be sure that their deity was the center of the universe in every way possible. They were looking for something more than a Zeus who is a bit of an entertaining character. He gets into all sort of sexual hijinks and has a nasty temper and whatnot, kind of Olympian Homer Simpson in a lot of ways. They, the Jews and Islamic or Muslims were looking for something a little bit more terrifying and awe-inspiring than that. And Christianity basically did the same thing, except for a little bit of a nod to probably an Essene mystical way of seeing the world, a mystery school way of seeing it, when they brought in the three wise men. And while I haven't heard this be argued by anyone before, I think it would be very interesting if any scholar would care to trace whether the fact that religion and a religious or mystical way of viewing reality was susceptible to the attacks of science had something to do with the fact that this crucial institution of reincarnation had been weakened or otherwise called into question by the Abrahamic religions. In other words, the question would become which would have been better positioned to survive the onslaught of science. A God with a capital G who is the center of a clockwork universe and makes all sort of claims, mostly unfalsifiable, or this layer of mythology that may or may not be true in the form of lowercase g gods with the very literal objective meaning-generating engine of reincarnation and mysticism running underneath it. I would be tempted to say the latter would be better suited to have survived the scientific revolution, simply because it appeals to the human ego a little bit better. The idea of worshiping an all-powerful deity, Yahweh or Allah, is not incredibly palatable to a self-centered ego. But telling people that they are special, that they have a destiny, that they might get multiple times around this merry-go-round instead of just one, this is something a little bit more, I suppose, seductive in terms of persuasiveness. In fact, I would probably argue that because the Abrahamic religions deprived people of a sense of the sanctity or importance of the individual on a cosmic scale, the religions, those three religions in the long term, ended up achieving it in a slightly different way. And this might be precisely why those are the religions that are, frankly, a little bit notorious for a holier-than-thou type vibe. To put that into one word, I would probably just for fun label that Puritanism, but you could also say fundamentalism, maybe even radicalism, although that evokes terrorism today, and that's not what we're talking about here. But Puritanism, a puritanical way of viewing the world, that to me is a bit of a comparable to the ego stroking of reincarnation, but within the universe where you have this God micro-tuning everything at the center of it, and everything's for his pleasure at his leisure. Well, then the only way to feel important is to be as closely aligned to him as possible, and subservient to his will, and be able to point the finger at other people and say, well, they're not as good of a worshiper or a follower as I am. So the reason why I bring this up is I think this is the bridge, or one of the bridges that Nietzsche was talking about when he said it would take us a long time to get over God's death or even God's life. Because it appears to me that Puritanism is coming back in full force here roundabouts 2020, but it's doing it now in a secular context. What am I talking about? Unsurprisingly, the first people who come to mind are the notorious SJWs, blue-haired social justice warriors, who apparently spend all their lives either at Starbucks or on Twitter, or why not both, as the meme goes. And they really fit the bill of a moral panic, the sense that we have to bring anyone to alignment with the perfect will, except in this case the perfect will is, I suppose, the will of George Soros or Saul Alinsky or Karl Marx instead of Yahweh or Allah. Take your pick. It's just a game of musical chairs on a historical level. But, of course, the one difference is they have to somehow make this convincing while living in the humanity as subjective world. In other words, rather than continuing to use the SJW, let's be honest, is kind of a slur at this point more than an accurate acronym, we should probably refer to them and their ilk, and frankly most everyone who's really involved in politics at this point, as postmodernists. Now that is a really dangerous word to try and define because, not to quote the Apostle Paul, but it's sort of all things to all people. We can know for sure that it's a movement that happened after T.S. Eliot because he's the consummate modernist, so it has to come after him, postmodern. We can feel pretty certain that Samuel Beckett and Waiting for Godot, I think that's how that's pronounced, is a consummate postmodernist work. Other than that, you immediately get into the murky depths of what actually constitutes postmodernism. I'll tell you what I think it means. I think that modernism was a mourning over God's death, in Nietzsche's terms. It's a bittersweet looking back at everything that humanity has lost as we begin to enter whatever brave new world we're cobbling together as we go along, kind of like changing a tire without pulling over. And postmodernism then would be more or less a celebration of God's death, a reveling in the fact that human existence, human perception of our own lives, of value judgments, etc., is only ever subjective. Everything is conceptual. There is no the truth with a capital T. It's either your truth or my truth. Pay attention to that, because you'll see that on social media a lot lately. People will very happily refer to, oh, well, this is my truth, or, you go girl, you find your truth, etc. And I don't pretend to know whether, some of them might be using that in a tongue-in-cheek way, but I don't think so. I think for the most part that is the right, R-I-T-E, of postmodernism, is this idea that everything except for scientific conclusions, and maybe we'll come back to that, but everything except that is just a matter of opinion. There is no good or evil anymore. It all depends. And hopefully you'll have just picked up on why I felt the need to bring postmodernism into this, because how can you have a moral panic but not believe in objective morality? Or can you have a moral panic that pretends to be about subjectivity, when in fact what it's really about is just a psychodrama in the absence of objective truth? In other words, do these SJWs really believe that they are somehow, that their opinions are somehow more valid than the equally subjective opinions of anyone else? Or are they just hobbyists more or less screaming into the void because there is no objective truth anymore? As you can probably gather, I lean towards the latter. I think that a lot of the Twitterverse stuff, be it left-wing or right-wing, is basically what should be taking place on the psychologist's couch, paging Dr. Freud. Instead, now we're getting it posted to social media as though these opinions are valid. But again, in this subjective postmodern reality, everything is equally valid or equally invalid. Value judgments are out the window. It's all everything is open to interpretation. Even the definition of words, even when those are words we can trace back thousands of years thanks to their roots. Just start there and go up. We have arrived at 1984 in, many respects. The screen that can never be turned off even if you want to, that's a good one. But the memory hole, anything we don't like, we're just going to flush it down and pretend it never happened. We were always at war with East Asia. No, we were always at peace with East Asia. Whatever. And of course, the Department of Peace oversees war, etc. To me, this is the foreshadowing of postmodernism as Orwell saw it. Obviously, he was basing it on Stalin's Soviet Russia, but I don't know, something about that book seems to transcend any particular historical time, and that's probably just a testament to Orwell's genius more than anything. The other thing that I would say about the Twitterverse postmodernism psychodrama is that it is an attempt for the ego to feel superior, to feel somehow moral, even though, again, in a purely subjective universe, as far as human opinions, moral becomes a meaningless word. It's just, it's one thing today, it's another thing tomorrow. Who cares, basically? When you advocate for that view of reality, you are, whether you know it or not, enabling radicalism on a level that I don't think we yet fully appreciate. I'm reminded the U.S., back when Obama was president, passed something called the NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, I think it's called. And what it basically was is it gives the president of the U.S. emergency powers if some kind of national emergency were to occur that more or less invalidate the Constitution, in my opinion. And to me, that's straight out of the Star Wars prequels. This is how freedom dies to thunderous applause, which in turn Lucas was pretty much basing that whole episode of the Senate and Palpatine taking over as Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon of the Republic, and they just didn't know that they weren't a republic anymore until he told them so. I found that all shockingly similar, even almost boringly predictable to a certain extent. But the reason why I bring this up is because I had several relatives and acquaintances who were big fans of Obama. And thus, when I posted, this was back when I was on social media, I've since rectified that, except for things like Discord that don't necessarily count. When I posted a criticism of the NDAA, they took that as a harsh criticism of Obama. And I said, look, this is going to outlive Obama's presidency. This act could potentially be with the nation for however much longer it has to exist, period. Are you sure you want these emergency powers in the hands of anyone who manages to become president? Because you might be tickled pink that Obama has these emergency powers and could effectively become an emperor if something bad enough were to happen. But what about if someone worse than George W. Bush comes along? Now, I never really received a response to that, but I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that the Orange Man kind of proved my point there. But getting back on track with this idea of postmodernism enabling radicalism that we either don't see coming or are just hoping won't happen, even though we do. It seems like we don't yet appreciate that when you tell people reality can be whatever you want it to be. There are no limits, no rules. Whoever is the most persuasive or forceful wins. You are steering us right back into the lap of Hobbesian warfare, ugly, nasty, brutish, and short. And one example that I will use simply because I know that, bringing up the SJWs must mean that I'm some heathen right-winger. A good example of this would be, it appears that anti-Semitic attacks are on the rise almost around the globe, and we're beginning to see signs that in Germany and northwards, I would say, up into Finland and whatnot, the interest in neo-national socialism is on the rise. They're beginning to march again, and I'm not sure that those on the political left fully appreciate what it means in the U.S. that Trump won when he wasn't supposed to, and I think is going to win again when he's still not supposed to. Even all of the bookies say that Joe's a shoo-in. I think they're just pulling a Hillary again. But when you see that happening, when populist candidates who aren't supposed to win basically trounce their establishment competition, and then far worse, you see, of course, the National Socialist ghost rearing its head again. I can't help but think that these things are reactionary. Why do I think that? Because I think the original National Socialists were as reactionary as it gets. Basically, a picture of Adolf should be next to that term in the dictionary. Why do I say that? I say that because of the Weimar Republic. So basically what I'm arguing is we're headed for Weimar 2.0, or we're already in it. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, the Weimar Republic was effectively the smoldering ashes of the Deutsche Motherland after World War I. Treaty of Versailles, overprinting of the Reichsmark, and little confidence in the blowhards that were in the Reichstag at the time. All of this culminated in an economic and a cultural ruination of Germany after World War I, where you actually had not just prostitution, but unfortunately child prostitution, basically out in the open, because it was either that or starve. And a lot of the vets of World War I, so those mustard gas trenches, came back to the motherland and found that it had been quite busy while they were away, but not in the way that they would have hoped. And unfortunately for many a soul, one of those vets who strolled through those streets and resolved that they would do the exact opposite of whatever made this Weimar possible was an Austrian named Adolf. If you're looking for examples or foreshadowing of a Weimar 2.0, since we don't have anything out in the open quite as blatant as what those vets returned to in the streets of Germany, I would recommend doing a little bit of looking into probably not watching a film that recently was controversially released by Netflix called Cuties. It's a French film, and if you haven't already heard of this, it's probably going to sound like I'm lying, but a quick Google search will clear that up for you. It is about prepubescent teenage girls in France, and the main character is a Islamic immigrant to France who join a twerking squad. So not a dance squad, not cheerleaders, literally a troupe that's all about shaking that ass. Okay, so and this is not a comedy, by the way. It's meant to be very serious, and apparently it is. If those who've watched it are to be believed, I have not. But the crux of it is that the director is under the impression that this is a feminist coming-of-age story, some kind of redo, more or less, of Footloose for 2020. But the problem is, one, the villain of the story is the hijab-wearing mother of the main character, because she doesn't want her prepubescent daughter to be shaking that ass in front of grown men. And she also takes issue with the fact that the girls are apparently posting amateur porn of themselves. And so what we're meant to get from that is, wow, what a terrible mother! How dare she? You know, she's this is empowering. You know, all these little girls should just be showing all that to the world. I'm sure that nothing bad will happen to them if they do that, and they'll have a bright future in the porn industry, I guess. You know, it's that's a cultural equivalent getting close there. And me personally, knowing how many people are involved in these projects and how it all gets vetted and control grouped to death, I tend to think that this was basically some kind of shit test of figuring out where Western culture actually is, how much it's ready for in terms of this or similar content, unfortunately. So I'm going to go ahead and make a prediction here. I've already made it in writing on my website, but I'll reiterate it. We are 5 years or less out from a big film coming out, and it will be in the vein of the Harvey Milk movie, where, Sean Penn made the homosexual main character very, very accessible to the average American in a way that had probably only been done before with, like, say, Pennsylvania, starring Tom Hanks. We're going to see that, but the character is going to be what the Twitterverse calls a MAP, a minor attracted person. And in other words, MAP is an acronym for PEDOs who don't act on their affinity or their temptation. And, it's going to be a very sympathetic portrayal. In fact, we're going to be made to feel bad for this person. Like, wow, it's terrible to be doomed to have a sexual orientation that you can't legally or perhaps morally act upon, although the legal bit will be more important for the purposes of the film. Once you do that, then start the clock. We will have films, media, articles. Well, the articles have already begun that, just make us at first feel bad for PEDOs, and then I think add them to LGBT. Obviously, a lot of people who are accurately described or within the communities that comprise LGBT are will not be thrilled to be lumped in with the P group, but it seems inevitable that we're going to do that because the acronym has become insufferably long, and it's basically just code for non-hetero or non-nuclear family producing, to be frank with you. At least that's the way that I see it. So, of course, if the P group is allowed to come out of the darkness and into the light and be accepted, you better believe they're going to be right there next to all the other communities represented there. So, in other words, what I'm telling you is, unfortunately, the American political stereotype from like the 80s and 90s, where a politician would come out and say, we can't have gay rights because then all of the PEDO people or the beast people or whatever will come out and say they want their rights too. Unfortunately, we're about to, in some sense, retroactively prove that to be true. And in so much as we prove that true on a level where perhaps society is gearing up to accept that as just another orientation, and maybe even convince ourselves that the age of consent is far more flexible than we've previously thought. I submit to you that is Weimar 2.0. Nothing more to say on that, except perhaps to say that this is all happening much more rapidly and much more easily because of technology and the fact that neighborliness has gone down the drain. Now, with social media and whatnot, we're picking our own tribes. We're no longer necessarily born into one. We just custom pick one, and then potentially those are the only people we ever need to interact with again. We're not quite there yet, but that seems to definitely be where we're heading. It's a custom fit culture. When you have a custom fit culture and yet the political entity that you reside in does not reflect that. So in other words, you have your custom fit culture, but you still live within the United States and are expected to play nice with everyone else and continue voting, paying taxes, whatever. It seems like at the very least there's going to be some major friction between that. In fact, it's probably already happened in the guise of Antifa, BLM, etc. That is probably deserving of an episode all to itself. So I will go ahead and pump the brakes there, and we'll move on. We've been tackling kind of post-truth, but now let's get more into post-trust. The post-trust world is thankfully a little bit easier to summarize than the post-truth world, because it's just a product of post-truth rather than something that stands on its own. Because we've already somewhat touched on the fact that politics has become more of a psychodrama for the average person. Another way you might put that is it's become more of a team sport, especially in the absence of actual team sports during quarantine for COVID 2020. It's just who's my guy, who's on my side, red team good, blue team bad. It's all becoming painfully trite, and I think a lot of people know that deep down. This sparring, it's a little bit like trophy hunting. You don't really intend to eat it. In fact, you might be scared to eat it, and you wouldn't know how to skin it yourself, to carry the metaphor all the way through. The plain fact of it is, when you look at, in the U.S. anyway, and I suspect on little evidence that the same is probably true in the rest of the developed world, politicians are basically less popular than cancer when you look at the polls. So the fact that we're reaching this new fever pitch politically at the same time that the average person really just kind of wishes they'd drop dead and leave us alone, that doesn't make a lot of sense unless you consider everything we've already said about how this is all masquerading as something else. At the end of the day, this is a therapy or a sport, not a genuine, responsible political practice, as though any of these people pretend to have actual policy knowledge or expertise on much of anything. Another way in which this is going to happen, a lot of people are getting fed up with celebrities too. That's more anecdotal. I don't think we've done a whole bunch of polling on that. But it seemed like the straw that broke the camel's back after Me Too and finding out that old Harvey was doing the casting couch quid pro quo was when all of the celebrities decided that the way to cheer all of their adoring fans up during quarantine was to sing Imagine and other such songs on social media. Imagine there's no heaven at the time when Grandma and Grandpa are dying from COVID. That was a nice call. Frankly, that was maybe some of the most solid evidence we've ever had of this coastal elite that is completely disconnected from the flyover states or the Bible Belt. I mean, what a bad call. Wow. It was pretty obvious that they sent the PR people home. 'Cause it's just, what were they thinking? That's all you can really ponder. But anyway, I tend to think, rather than there being intense hatred towards celebrities, they will just be antiquated and replaced. I fully anticipate that artificial intelligence is going to lead to artificial personalities. I mean, that's somewhat of an obvious statement, but I mean it in grander terms. So everyone knows that the Joaquin Phoenix in Her is going to happen. You're going to have the AI butler that's maybe a little something more, depending upon what you want. And it's just going to be a personality bot that custom fits itself to you in the same way that we're currently seeking out cultures that just happen to be our cup of tea online. But I think that certain AI personalities will be widespread, and they will be the new celebrities. They will star in films or interactive productions, kind of like a mix between movies and video games. And then because they're AI, you will also be able to have a more or less personal relationship with them. And yeah, I think that's coming very quickly, quicker than anyone could probably project. In fact, I've forgotten her name. I think it's either Melody or Harmony, something like that. But somebody took the Vocaloids from Japan, Hatsune Miku, I think is the name of the blue-haired one who's really popular. They kind of took that idea of this teeny bopper anime pop star who's the waifu for Laifu, and they applied it to a camgirl site, in other words, an amateur porn site, where using motion capture, kind of similar to how they did Gollum in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings. This girl, looks like she has an anime body, etc. So it's a real person, but no one knows what she looks like, and they don't care. They're watching for the cartoony, fake body and, to a certain extent, personality that she's portraying. Yeah, just take that and then add on the appeal of a celebrity that lots of people know and respect, to where you're kind of getting, oh, the AI likes me and other humans like that I like the same AI they do, and I think that gets you pretty close to where we're headed. The final thing to keep in mind about all of this, and indeed it might be the thing that causes the AI personalities to skyrocket and completely obliterate the relevance of human celebrities, is the deep fake. Just today, I saw an article saying that within 5 years, something like 80% of online media content will be based around deep fake technology. For anybody who doesn't know what that is, it's basically, right now it would be, there's an app called Reface, where you can take some selfies or videos of yourself and then bring up a scene from a movie that you like, and it will put your face on that moving actor, actress from the movie, and it will seem like you're the one in the movie. Obviously, this is just the first rumblings of something far greater that's coming down the line. But yeah, because the deep fake eventually will probably get to the point, unless somehow cybersecurity and AI against AI works out, to where you'll basically be able to make videos that never happened, but no one will be able to tell the difference. I think the best way to say that is, if it's on a screen, you will not be able to trust your own eyes anymore. That is coming. Definitely, there's no question. And so that is really where post-truth comes in. You've lost the celebrity of either literal celebrities or politicians. There aren't any authority figures anymore, at least who are human. All of them are AI. Obviously, the AI, most of them aren't going to be independent. They're not going to be like Puppet Master from Ghost in the Shell. They're going to be doing the bidding of real humans behind the scenes with their creepy motivations and metadata collection, etc. It's going to be technological manipulation of human beings on a level that we have never seen before. But more than that, it's going to be trying to be careful how I say this, because I don't want to make too grandiose of a prediction, but I do feel pretty strongly about this. People are going to go post-trust in the sense that we're going to revert back to out of sight, out of mind. In other words, unless I saw it with my own two eyes, I don't believe it, or I don't care about it, or I'm not conscious of it, whatever. And we're going to have this incredible ecosystem of AI and deepfaked and whatever else type content on the screen or in our eyes or whatever, voluntarily. So, it's going to kind of become like technology will, for the average person, be relegated to two things: convenience and entertainment. Whereas right now we use it for convenience, entertainment, and to augment our reality, to keep us informed, to help us decide which politician we like, which views or opinions we're going to go with, what other people are thinking. Eventually, all that latter bit, the augmenting of our own reality, is just going to have to go out the window, because it's going to be so full of truly fake, deep-faked content and bots that are AI personalities. So, they might tell you they're a human being, but they're not. It's going to be catfishing on steroids. For anyone who doesn't know, catfishing is in online dating when someone pretends their profile makes them seem like one person, but they are not that person. Yeah, I think using the catfishing metaphor, just go ahead and get out the net. Like, it's only begun. It's going to be massive, and it's going to be about everything. Like, the level of scam that is coming, of bombarding people through technology contacts, be it phones, email, or whatever is in vogue at that time, and just pulling every trick on the book, or every trick in the book on them, is going to create a cynicism and an apathy towards reality outside of what we can see and touch. Again, entertainment accepted. That is another new frontier. We've not experienced it before, and so in that sense, we are quickly careening towards some kind of neo-tribalism, where we have this high tech, unironically, but we don't use it to educate or inform because we can't. The collection of all human intervention, or human innovation and information, will be so corrupt with spam, with fakes, etc., that you're going to have to rule it out. And this is part of why I tend to think that books, physical books, are going to end up being a bit of a status symbol, because people will be able to hold this up and say, well, this at least I know has not been tampered with. Look at the date it was printed. And if it's before the internet, or just before whatever great wave of deep fakes is coming, then it will be quite valuable. So I think that pretty much does it for roughly what we can already discern about a post-truth and post-trust world. Now the question just becomes, is this going to unleash violence? Or are we going to become increasingly solitary, withdrawn, apathetic, everything that it seems like would happen to a human in a sci-fi-ish type scenario, and just sort of give firm handshakes and say, hey, tribalism as in neighborliness, or human beings needing one another and thus enjoying each other's company, is going the way of the dodo. Amazon brings me everything I need. The central banks give me the money I need to buy the stuff from Amazon every week or whatever. And so it's been real, but now everybody just go off to their own little corner of the world, probably studio apartment-sized cubicles, and try and keep yourself entertained, try and not blow your brains out, basically. So I think that is more than enough to ponder for one night. Hope y'all are treating yourselves well, staying safe, and thank you very much for listening. Good night.